The phone rang at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, jarring me awake from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in weeks. My girlfriend Maya stirred beside me in our small apartment in Portland, her dark hair spilling across the pillow as she squinted at me through the darkness. "Hello?" I whispered, already knowing this call would change everything. "Jessica, honey, it's your Aunt Linda." Her voice was strained, tired in a way that went beyond the late hour. "I'm at Providence Medical Center in Nashville. Your grandmother had another stroke tonight. This one was significant." I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Grandma Rose had been the most important person in my life for 26 years, the one constant source of unconditional love in a family that had grown increasingly cold toward me over the past 5 years. She'd raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7, filling the void with homemade cookies, bedtime stories, and the kind of fierce protection that only grandmothers possess. "How significant?" I asked, though I could hear the answer in Linda's silence. "The doctors say she might not make it through the week. She's conscious right now, but barely. Jessica, I think you should come home." Home. The word felt complicated in my mouth. I hadn't been back to Nashville since Christmas 3 years ago, when my Uncle Tom had made it clear that my lifestyle choices were no longer welcome at family gatherings. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same people who'd embraced me as the orphaned granddaughter needing their love had rejected me the moment I found love of my own. "Is she asking for me?" I said, hating how small my voice sounded. "She's been asking for you for months, honey, ever since you stopped calling." Linda's voice carried no judgment, just exhaustion and sadness. "I know things have been difficult with the family, but she's your grandmother. She loves you." After I hung up, Maya wrapped her arms around me from behind, her warmth anchoring me to the present moment even as memories of Nashville threatened to pull me under. "You have to go," she said simply. "I can't. You don't understand what it's like there, how they look at us, the things they say." I leaned back against her, drawing strength from her steady presence. When I came out to the family 5 years ago, only Grandma didn't react like I'd announced I had a terminal illness. But even she never actually said she accepted it. She just changed the subject whenever I mentioned dating women. Maya was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing gentle circles on my arms. "Jess, what if she dies and you never get to say goodbye? What if you spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been different if you'd been brave enough to face them one more time?" I knew she was right, but the thought of walking back into that house, into that world where I'd spent 5 years being treated like a disappointment, felt impossible. My family wasn't overtly cruel. They were too polite, too Southern for outright hostility. Instead, they wielded silence like a weapon, exclusion like punishment, and the constant suggestion that I was choosing to be difficult rather than simply being myself. "Come with me," I said suddenly, turning to face Maya in the darkness. "I can't do this alone." Maya's expression grew thoughtful. We'd been together for 3 years, living together for 1, and she'd heard countless stories about my complicated relationship with my Tennessee family. She knew they'd never met her, never acknowledged her existence, never asked about the person who'd become the most important part of my life. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" she asked gently. "Meeting your dying grandmother and your hostile family at the same time might be overwhelming for everyone involved." "I don't care if it's overwhelming for them," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I'm tired of hiding who I am to make them comfortable. I'm tired of pretending that the most important relationship in my life doesn't exist just to avoid their disapproval." Maya smiled, the expression I'd fallen in love with 3 years ago when we'd met at a poetry reading in downtown Portland. She was a librarian with an infectious laugh and the kind of gentle strength that had helped me believe I deserved love that didn't come with conditions. "Then we'll go together," she said. "I'd like to meet the woman who raised someone as incredible as you." The next morning, I called in sick to my job at the nonprofit where I managed grants for homeless services, and Maya arranged for a colleague to cover her shifts at the library. By noon, we were on a plane to Nashville, my hands shaking as I stared out the window at clouds that looked like they were carrying me back to a past I'd spent years trying to escape. Nashville in March was exactly as I remembered, cool and gray, with that particular quality of light that made everything look like it was filtered through old photographs. Maya rented us a car at the airport, and as we drove through the familiar streets of my childhood, I felt the weight of memory settling over me like a heavy coat. "That's the high school where I was valedictorian," I said, pointing to a sprawling brick building surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns. "And that's the church where I was baptized, confirmed, and eventually told that my sexual orientation was incompatible with Christian values. Maya reached over and took my hand. "Tell me about your grandmother. What was she like when you were growing up?" The question opened a floodgate of memories I'd been keeping carefully locked away. She was everything, especially after my parents died. She taught me to bake bread from scratch, to plant tomatoes in rows so straight they looked like soldiers, to stand up for myself even when it was scary. She was the first person to tell me I was smart enough for college, the first person to believe I could be anything I wanted to be. She sounds wonderful. She was. Is. God, I hope she still is. I pulled into the parking lot of Grandview Manor, the assisted living facility, where Grandma Rose had been living for the past 2 years. The building was newer than I'd expected, all brick and glass with landscaping that suggested comfort and dignity rather than institutional neglect. "Are you ready for this?" Maya asked as we sat in the car, both of us staring at the entrance where my past and present were about to collide in ways I couldn't predict. "No," I said honestly, "but let's do it anyway." The lobby of Grandview Manor smelled like lavender and floor wax, with that particular combination of cleanliness and sadness that seemed to permeate places where people went to wait for death. The receptionist, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, directed us to the 3rd floor, where the memory care unit housed residents with dementia and other cognitive impairments. "Jessica?" A familiar voice called my name as we stepped off the elevator. My Aunt Linda stood in the hallway, looking older than I remembered, but wearing the same expression of determined cheerfulness that had characterized her throughout my childhood. "Oh, honey, I'm so glad you came." She hugged me tightly, and I felt some of the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. Linda had always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who tried to bridge differences and smooth over conflicts. She'd never explicitly supported my relationship with Maya, but she'd never condemned it either, maintaining a careful neutrality that felt like kindness compared to the rest of the family's reaction. "Linda, this is Maya," I said, my heart pounding as I made the introduction I'd been rehearsing for 3 years. "My partner." Linda's smile didn't waver, though I saw her process the word partner and everything it implied. "Maya, it's lovely to meet you. Thank you for coming with Jessica. I know this isn't easy." Maya stepped forward with the grace and confidence that had first attracted me to her. "Thank you for calling Jessica. I know how much her grandmother means to her. How is she?" I asked, as Linda led us down a hallway lined with bulletin boards displaying photos of residents in happier times. "Weak," Linda said simply. "The stroke affected her speech, and she's been drifting in and out of consciousness. But Jessica, she's been asking for you constantly." Your name was one of the first words she could say clearly after the stroke. We stopped outside room 314, and Linda turned to face us both. "I should warn you. Tom is in there with her right now. He's still struggling with your choices, Jessica. Please try to be patient with him." My Uncle Tom had been like a father to me after my parents died, taking me to softball games and helping with homework and walking me down the aisle at my high school graduation. His rejection of my sexuality had been one of the most painful losses of the past 5 years, transforming someone who'd once been my protector into someone who couldn't look me in the eye without disappointment clouding his features. "I'll try," I said, though we both knew that patience had limits. Linda knocked softly and pushed open the door to reveal a room that felt more like a hotel suite than a medical facility. Grandma Rose lay in a hospital bed surrounded by flowers, her silver hair spread across the pillow like spun silk. She looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, but her eyes were open and alert as they focused on the doorway. Tom sat in a chair beside the bed, his face cycling through surprise, discomfort, and something that might have been relief as he saw me. "Jessica," he said, standing awkwardly. "I didn't think you were coming." "Of course I came," I said, moving toward the bed where the woman who'd raised me was waiting with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Hi, Grandma." Her mouth moved, forming words that came out as whispers. "My girl, my beautiful girl." I took her hand, surprised by how cold it felt, how thin her fingers had become. Behind me, I was acutely aware of Maya standing in the doorway, of Tom's rigid posture, of Linda trying to navigate the emotional minefield that our family had become. "Grandma, there's someone I want you to meet," I said, my voice barely steady. "This is Maya. She's very important to me." Maya stepped forward, her composure intact, despite the obvious tension in the room. "Mrs. Henley, it's an honor to meet you. Jessica talks about you constantly." Grandma Rose's eyes moved slowly to Maya's face, taking in her features with the careful attention of someone who understood that first impressions might also be last impressions. The silence stretched between us, filled with years of unspoken questions and unacknowledged truths. Tom cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Jessica, I think we should discuss your friend's presence here. This is a family time and—" "Maya is family," I said firmly, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "She's been my partner for 3 years. She's the person who takes care of me when I'm sick, who celebrates my successes, who knows me better than anyone else in the world. If that's not family, I don't know what is." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Tom's face flushed red. Linda looked like she was trying to disappear into the wallpaper, and Grandma Rose continued to study Maya with an intensity that made my heart race. Then, slowly, Grandma Rose lifted her free hand toward Maya. "Come here, child." Maya approached the bed cautiously, and Grandma Rose took her hand in her thin fingers. "You love my Jessica? More than anything," Maya said without hesitation. "Good," Grandma Rose whispered, her voice gaining strength. "Good." The simple word carried more weight than any speech could have. In that single syllable, I heard acceptance, approval, and the kind of unconditional love I'd been afraid I'd lost forever. Tom's face went from red to white, and Linda began crying quietly in the corner. But Grandma Rose wasn't finished. With effort that clearly cost her, she pulled Maya closer until their faces were just inches apart. Then, in a voice that was weak but unmistakably clear, she said the words that would change everything. "I always knew, sweetheart. I was just waiting for you to be ready to tell me. And I want you to know, I'm proud. I'm so proud of the woman you've become, of the love you've found, of the courage it took to be yourself when it would have been easier to hide." The room fell completely silent, except for the sound of Linda's quiet sobs and the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment. Maya was crying now too, tears streaming down her face as she held my grandmother's hand. Tom stared at the floor, his jaw working like he was trying to process information that challenged everything he thought he knew about our family, and I felt something inside my chest crack open, not breaking, but healing. 5 years of carrying the weight of rejection, of wondering if the woman who'd raised me could truly love me as I was, of believing that authenticity came at the cost of family, all of it dissolved in the face of my grandmother's whispered acceptance. "You knew?" I managed to ask through my tears. Grandma Rose smiled, the expression transforming her face from that of a dying woman to that of the fierce protector who'd raised me. "Honey, I've known since you were 15 years old and couldn't stop talking about Sarah Mitchell in your English class. I've been waiting 26 years for you to trust me enough to tell me the truth." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. All those years of careful silence, of changing the subject when relationships came up, of assuming that her lack of questions meant lack of acceptance, she'd been protecting my right to come out on my own terms, waiting with infinite patience for me to feel safe enough to be honest. "But you never said anything," I whispered. "It wasn't my truth to speak," she replied. "It was yours. I just wanted you to know that when you were ready, I'd be here. And I wanted you to know that love, real love, the kind that lasts, is always worth celebrating, no matter what package it comes in." Tom finally looked up from the floor, his face a mixture of confusion and pain. "Mama, I don't understand. How can you be okay with this when the Bible clearly says—" "Thomas," Grandma Rose said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd raised 5 children and buried a husband. "I've read that Bible more times than you have, and I know what it says about love. It says love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy or boast. It says love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. It says love never fails." She paused, gathering strength for what would clearly be her most important speech. I look at Jessica and Maya, and I see 2 people who've found something rare and precious in this world. I see kindness, commitment, joy, and the kind of deep partnership that most people spend their whole lives searching for. If you can look at that kind of love and see sin instead of blessing, then you're reading a different book than I am. The silence that followed was profound. Tom's face had gone through several color changes. Linda was openly weeping, and Maya was holding my grandmother's hand like it was an anchor in a storm. But Grandma Rose wasn't finished with her revelations. With visible effort, she turned back to me, her eyes bright with the kind of clarity that sometimes comes to people approaching the end of their lives. "Jessica, honey, there's something else I need to tell you while I still can." My grandmother's words hung in the air as she struggled to gather the strength for whatever revelation was coming next. The room felt charged with anticipation, and the weight of family secrets that were finally surfacing after decades of careful burial. "Grandma, you should rest," I said, worried about the effort it was clearly taking for her to speak. "Whatever it is can wait." "No, sweetheart, it can't wait," she said with more firmness than I'd heard in her voice since we'd arrived. "I'm 89 years old. I've had 2 strokes, and there are things you need to know before I'm gone. Things about our family, about love, about the courage it takes to be authentic in a world that often punishes honesty." Maya squeezed my hand as Grandma Rose closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength. When she opened them again, they were focused with laser intensity on Tom, who still stood frozen by the window like a man who'd had his worldview shattered and hadn't yet figured out how to put the pieces back together. "Thomas, sit down," she commanded, and despite being a 58-year-old successful businessman, my uncle immediately obeyed his mother's directive. "What I'm about to tell you might be difficult to hear, but it's time. Past time." Linda had stopped crying and was now watching the scene unfold with the fascination of someone witnessing history being made. Maya continued to hold Grandma Rose's hand, her presence providing comfort that I suspect my grandmother had been craving for years. "Your father," Grandma Rose began, looking directly at Tom, "was not the first man I loved." The words hit the room like a physical force. Tom's face went white. Linda gasped audibly, and I felt my understanding of our family history tilt on its axis. "Mama, what are you talking about?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Before I married your daddy in 1954, I was in love with someone else, someone I couldn't marry, couldn't be with, couldn't even acknowledge publicly without destroying both our lives." Grandma Rose's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if sharing this long-held secret was somehow energizing her. "I don't understand," Linda said from her corner. "Who were you in love with?" Grandma Rose smiled, and for a moment I could see the young woman she'd been 70 years ago, full of passion and hope and dreams that had to be hidden away like contraband. "Her name was Catherine Mills. She worked at the library downtown, and she was the most beautiful, intelligent, kind woman I'd ever met. We fell in love when I was 22 years old, and for 2 years, we found ways to be together despite living in a world that would have destroyed us if anyone had known." The silence in the room was absolute. Tom looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Linda appeared to be processing information that rewrote everything she thought she knew about her mother, and Maya was watching my grandmother with an expression of profound recognition and respect. "We couldn't hold hands in public, couldn't go to dances together, couldn't tell our families or friends. We had to love each other in secret, in stolen moments, in the shadows of a society that saw our feelings as shameful instead of sacred." Tears were flowing down Grandma Rose's cheeks now, but her voice remained steady. "What happened to her?" I asked gently, already sensing that this story didn't have a happy ending. "Catherine's parents found letters I'd written to her. Love letters that made it clear we were more than just friends. They threatened to have me arrested, to destroy my family's reputation, to make sure I never worked in this town again. Catherine was forced to choose between me and everything else she'd ever known." Grandma Rose paused, the pain of 70-year-old rejection still visible in her eyes. "She chose survival over love. She married a man from Birmingham 6 months later and moved away. I never saw her again, but I heard through mutual friends that she was never happy. She had 3 children and lived what everyone else considered a successful life, but people who knew her said she always seemed like she was missing something essential." Tom was staring at his mother, like she'd transformed into a completely different person. "So, you married Daddy as, what, a consolation prize?" "I married your father because he was a good man, who offered me a life that was socially acceptable," Grandma Rose said without shame. "And I did grow to love him, deeply and truly, but it was a different kind of love than what I'd had with Catherine. It was chosen love rather than inevitable love, partnership rather than passion." "Did he know?" Linda asked quietly. "He suspected, I think. Your daddy was perceptive about people's hearts, but we never talked about it directly. It was a different time, children. People didn't discuss such things, even with their spouses. The revelations were rewriting my understanding of my grandmother's entire life. The woman I'd thought I knew completely had been carrying the weight of lost love and forced conformity for 7 decades, smiling through family dinners and church services, while harboring a secret that could have destroyed her if it had been discovered. "Is this why you never seemed surprised when I came out?" I asked. "Because you'd lived through your own version of being closeted?" "Partly," she said, turning back to me with eyes full of love and recognition, but also because I saw how you looked at girls from the time you were a teenager. I saw the way you lit up when you talked about your female friends, the way you seemed uninterested in the boys who were clearly interested in you. I recognized the signs because I'd lived them myself. Why didn't you tell me? The question came out more hurt than I'd intended. All those years when I was struggling with coming out, when I was terrified that my family would reject me, why didn't you let me know that you understood? Grandma Rose squeezed Maya's hand and looked at me with infinite tenderness. Because your journey needed to be your own, sweetheart. I couldn't give you courage. You had to find it yourself. I couldn't make your choices for you. You had to make them yourself. All I could do was love you unconditionally and wait for you to trust me with your truth. But you could have saved me years of anxiety and fear, I protested. No, honey, I couldn't have. The anxiety and fear were part of your process, part of how you developed the strength to live authentically in a world that often punishes authenticity. If I'd made it too easy, you might not have developed the resilience you needed to build the life you have now. Maya spoke for the first time since the revelations had begun. Mrs. Henley, what would you have done differently if you could live your life over again? Grandma Rose considered the question seriously. I would have fought harder for Catherine. I would have been willing to risk everything for love instead of choosing safety over authenticity. I would have trusted that real love was worth any sacrifice. But you did love Grandpa, Tom said, clearly struggling to reconcile these new revelations with his memories of his parents' marriage. I did love him, she confirmed. But I loved him with the part of my heart that was left after I'd given the deepest part of myself to someone I couldn't keep. He deserved better than that, and so did I. The room fell quiet, as we all processed the magnitude of what Grandma Rose had shared. This woman who'd seemed like the embodiment of conventional 1950s domesticity had been harboring a secret that connected her directly to my own struggle with identity and acceptance. Is Catherine still alive? Linda asked. She died 5 years ago, Grandma Rose said sadly. I saw her obituary in the Birmingham paper. She was survived by her 3 children and 7 grandchildren, but the obituary mentioned that her husband had died 20 years earlier. I wondered if she ever thought about me, if she ever regretted the choice she made. I'm sure she did, Maya said softly. Love like that doesn't just disappear. Tom had been silent throughout this exchange, but now he looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mama, I don't know what to do with this information. Everything I thought I knew about our family, about you, about what's right and wrong, it's all different now. That's exactly how it should feel when someone tells you the truth, Grandma Rose replied. The truth is supposed to change things, Thomas. It's supposed to make you question your assumptions and examine your beliefs. But what about the church? What about what we were taught about family values and moral behavior? Grandma Rose's expression grew firm, taking on the authority of someone who'd lived through decades of hiding her authentic self and had learned hard lessons about the cost of conformity. The church taught us that love was the highest virtue, that we should treat others as we would want to be treated, that God looks at the heart rather than the outward appearance. The problem was never with the message. It was with people who decided to interpret that message through the lens of their own fears and prejudices. She turned her attention back to me, her voice growing urgent with the weight of time running out. Jessica, honey, I need you to understand something. When I see you with Maya, when I see the way you look at each other, the way you take care of each other, the way you've built a life together, I see everything I gave up when I chose safety over authenticity. You have what I never had the courage to fight for. But you could have had it, I said, my heart breaking for the young woman my grandmother had been. You could have chosen love. Maybe, she said, but probably not. The world was different then, sweetheart. The consequences would have been severe. Job loss, family rejection, possible imprisonment. Catherine and I would have had to leave everything behind and start over somewhere else. And even then, we would have had to live carefully, always looking over our shoulders. Do you regret not taking that risk? Grandma Rose was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant with memories of roads not taken. I regret not giving love a chance to prove it was stronger than fear. I regret spending 70 years wondering what if. I regret that Catherine died without knowing that I never stopped loving her, never stopped thinking about her, never stopped wishing we'd been brave enough to choose each other. The pain in her voice was raw and immediate despite the decades that had passed. Maya was crying again, and I realized that my grandmother's story was both a gift and a warning, a gift of understanding and acceptance, but also a warning about the cost of choosing safety over authenticity. Is this why you're proud of me? I asked. Because I did what you couldn't do? I'm proud of you because you had the courage to be yourself even when it was difficult, she said. I'm proud of you because you chose love over fear, authenticity over acceptance, truth over comfort. I'm proud of you because you didn't let other people's limitations define your possibilities. Tom finally spoke again, his voice heavy with confusion and pain. Mama, I still don't understand how this changes what the Bible says about... Thomas? Grandma Rose interrupted, her voice carrying decades of accumulated wisdom and a lifetime of hard-won insights about faith and love. The Bible says a lot of things. It says to love your neighbor as yourself. It says to judge not lest you be judged. It says that God is love, and whoever lives in love lives in God. If you're using scripture to justify treating your niece with anything less than complete acceptance and celebration, then you're reading it wrong. The words hit Tom like a physical blow, and I could see him struggling to reconcile his mother's interpretation with the religious teachings that had shaped his worldview. But the church, he began. The church is made up of imperfect people doing their best to understand God's will, Grandma Rose said firmly. Sometimes they get it right, and sometimes they get it spectacularly wrong. When they get it wrong, it's usually because they're letting fear and tradition override love and compassion. She turned back to me with an intensity that made it clear this was the most important thing she would ever say to me. Jessica, I want you to promise me something. Promise me that you'll never let anyone, not family, not church, not society, convince you that your love is less valid, less sacred, less worthy of celebration than anyone else's. Promise me that you'll fight for what you have with Maya, that you'll protect it and nurture it and never take it for granted. I promise, Grandma. And promise me that you'll forgive this family for the pain we've caused you. Not because we deserve forgiveness, but because carrying anger and resentment will only poison your own happiness. You deserve to be free from that burden. The request was harder than the first promise, but looking at my grandmother's face, seeing the love and regret and hope mixed together, I knew she was right. I promised that too. Grandma Rose smiled then, the expression transforming her face from that of a dying woman to that of someone who had finally been able to set down a burden she'd been carrying for 7 decades. Good. Now I can rest peacefully, knowing that the love I never had the courage to fight for lives on in you and Maya, knowing that my granddaughter had the strength I never could find, the courage I never could muster. As if speaking these truths had finally freed her to let go, Grandma Rose closed her eyes and seemed to sink deeper into her pillows. Her breathing became slower, more labored, and the monitors around her bed began showing the subtle changes that indicated her body was beginning to shut down. But she had given me something more precious than I could have imagined. Not just acceptance and approval, but understanding. She had shown me that my struggle with identity and family acceptance was part of a longer story, that the courage I'd found to live authentically was built on the foundation of her sacrifice and her dreams deferred. The healing that began in that hospital room would continue long after she was gone, rippling through our family and changing everything about how we understood love, courage, and the price of authenticity. But in that moment, as Maya held my hand and my grandmother rested peacefully after finally telling her truth, I felt complete in ways I'd never experienced before. I was not alone in my journey. I was not the first in my family to love deeply and struggle with acceptance. I was the continuation of a story that had begun decades before my birth, the fulfillment of dreams that my grandmother had been forced to abandon, but had never stopped believing in. And that knowledge changed everything. The 3 days that followed Grandma Rose's revelations were unlike anything I'd experienced in my adult life. Word of her condition spread through our extended family and the broader Nashville community, bringing a steady stream of visitors to her hospital room. Each conversation became an opportunity for truth-telling, healing, and the kind of honest family discussion that had been decades in the making. Maya and I had checked into a hotel near the hospital, but we spent most of our time in room 314, watching my grandmother drift in and out of consciousness, while family members grappled with information that challenged everything they thought they knew about love, faith, and what it meant to live authentically. The first major conversation came with my cousin Rebecca, Tom's daughter, who arrived from Memphis still wearing her scrubs from her job as an emergency room nurse. Rebecca was 2 years younger than me, and we'd been close as children, but the family dynamics around my sexuality had created distance between us over the past 5 years. "Jessica," she said, as she entered the room where Maya and I were sitting beside Grandma Rose's bed. "I heard about what Grandma told y'all yesterday, about Catherine, about her past. Is it true?" "It's true," I confirmed. watching Rebecca's face as she processed this information. Rebecca sat down heavily in the visitor's chair, looking like someone who'd had their world rearranged while they weren't paying attention. I can't believe she kept that secret for 70 years. I can't believe she went through all of that alone. She wasn't completely alone, Maya said gently. She had her memories, her love for Catherine, and eventually she had Jessica to love unconditionally. But it must have been so lonely, Rebecca said, tears forming in her eyes, to have to hide such a fundamental part of yourself for your entire life. I watched my cousin struggle with empathy for my grandmother's situation, and I could see the moment when understanding clicked into place. "Oh God," Rebecca whispered, looking directly at me. "Jessica, is that what it's been like for you? All these years when the family has been treating you like you chose to be difficult, like you could just decide to be different. Have you been feeling as lonely and isolated as Grandma must have felt?" The question broke open something in my chest that I'd been holding carefully closed. "Yes," I said simply. "That's exactly what it's been like." Rebecca began crying in earnest then, the kind of tears that come from recognizing harm you've caused without meaning to. "I'm so sorry, Jess. I'm so sorry we made you feel that way. I thought if we just didn't talk about it, if we pretended everything was normal, that somehow it would be easier for everyone." "Silence isn't neutral, Rebecca," Maya said, her voice gentle but firm. "When someone shares something fundamental about who they are and they're met with silence, that silence feels like rejection. I know that now," Rebecca said. "I can see it now, but at the time, I thought I was being supportive by not making it a big deal. Making it a big deal would have been better than making it invisible," I said. "I needed to know that my family could celebrate my happiness, not just tolerate my existence." The conversation with Rebecca lasted for 2 hours, during which she asked dozens of questions about my relationship with Maya, my experience coming out, and what kind of support I'd needed from family that I hadn't received. By the time she left, she was making plans to drive back to Memphis to have similar conversations with her own children about acceptance, understanding, and the difference between tolerance and celebration. But the most difficult conversation came the next morning, when my Uncle Tom returned to the hospital, his face showing the effects of a sleepless night spent wrestling with revelations that had fundamentally challenged his worldview. "Jessica," he said as he entered the room, "I need to talk to you. And to Maya, I need to apologize, and I need to understand some things." Maya and I exchanged glances. Tom had been the most vocal opponent of my sexuality within the family, the one whose rejection had hurt the most, because he'd been such an important father figure during my childhood. "Okay," I said cautiously. "What do you want to understand?" Tom sat down across from us, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I've been thinking about what Mama said yesterday, about love being love regardless of what package it comes in. I've been thinking about Catherine, about the life Mama might have had if she'd been able to choose love over fear." He paused, clearly struggling with emotions he wasn't accustomed to expressing. "I've also been thinking about you, about the little girl I helped raise after your parents died, the little girl who was so smart, so funny, so full of life. And I've been trying to understand how I let my discomfort with your sexuality overshadow everything else I knew about who you are. Because you were taught that my sexuality was wrong," I said, not unkindly. "Because the church and society told you that people like me were broken, or sinful, or choosing to be difficult. But you're not broken," Tom said, his voice breaking slightly. "Looking at you with Maya, seeing how you take care of each other, how happy you are together. There's nothing broken about that. There's nothing sinful about that." Maya reached over and took my hand, her presence providing strength for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. "Tom," I said, "I need you to understand something. When you rejected my sexuality, you rejected me. Not just a part of me that you were uncomfortable with, but the whole person I am. My relationship with Maya isn't separate from my identity. It's central to who I am, to my happiness, to my sense of completeness. I know that now," he said. "I can see it now. But Jessica, I was raised to believe that there was only one acceptable way to love someone, only one kind of relationship that God approved of. Changing those beliefs, it's not easy. I'm not asking you to change your beliefs overnight," I said. "I'm asking you to love me enough to examine them, to consider the possibility that they might be wrong, to prioritize our relationship over your discomfort." Tom was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about faith, morality, and family. "Can you help me understand?" he asked finally. "Can you tell me what it's been like for you, having to navigate family relationships, while also trying to be authentic about who you are. So I told him. I told him about the years of confusion and self-doubt, about the fear that coming out would cost me the only family I had left after my parents died. I told him about the loneliness of family gatherings, where I felt like I had to hide the most important part of my life, about the pain of being excluded from conversations about relationships and future plans. Maya shared her own perspective, talking about what it felt like to love someone whose family couldn't acknowledge her existence, about the complicated emotions of watching the person you love be hurt by people who were supposed to protect them. I never thought about how it affected Maya, Tom admitted. I was so focused on what I saw as Jessica's choices that I never considered the impact on someone who was completely innocent in all of this. Maya isn't innocent because she's done nothing wrong, I corrected. We're both innocent because we've done nothing wrong. Loving each other, building a life together, being happy. None of that requires innocence because none of it is wrong. The conversation continued for hours, with Tom asking difficult questions, and Maya and I providing honest answers about everything from the practical aspects of our relationship to the spiritual journey of reconciling faith with sexuality. By the end, Tom wasn't completely transformed, but he was genuinely trying to understand, genuinely committed to repairing our relationship. I can't promise that I'll get everything right immediately, he said as he prepared to leave, but I can promise that I'll keep working at it, keep examining my beliefs, keep prioritizing love over fear. That's all I can ask for, I said, and meant it. The most unexpected conversation came that afternoon when Pastor Williams from Grandma Rose's church appeared in the doorway. I hadn't seen him in 5 years, not since the conversation where he'd informed me that my sexual orientation was incompatible with Christian values and that I wouldn't be welcome to serve in church leadership roles. Jessica, he said, his voice uncertain, I heard about your grandmother's condition. I wanted to come pay my respects. Of course, I said, though I felt my defenses rising automatically. Pastor Williams was a man in his 60s who'd led the congregation for 20 years. He'd baptized me, confirmed me, and ultimately rejected me, all in the name of faithful adherence to Scripture. His presence in the room felt like a test of some kind. I also heard, he said carefully, about some revelations your grandmother shared yesterday, about her past, about her understanding of love and acceptance. I waited for him to continue, unsure where this conversation was heading. Rose Henley has been a member of our congregation for 40 years, he said. She served on every committee, taught Sunday school, organized countless fundraisers for mission work. She's been one of the most faithful, loving, godly women I've ever known. Yes, she has, I agreed. And yesterday I learned that she's been carrying the burden of lost love for 70 years, that she's understood things about faith and sexuality that I've been too blind to see. Pastor Williams sat down heavily, looking like a man who'd had his theological foundations shaken. Pastor Williams, Maya said gently, what are you trying to say? I'm trying to say that maybe I've been wrong, he said simply. Maybe the church has been wrong. Maybe we've been so focused on rules and regulations that we've lost sight of the fundamental message of love and acceptance. The admission hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. I'd never expected to hear such words from the man who'd been instrumental in my decision to leave the church. Jessica, he continued, I owe you an apology. I owe Maya an apology. I let fear and tradition override love and compassion, and in doing so, I failed to represent the God I serve. Thank you, I said, not sure what else to say in response to such an unexpected admission. Would you be willing to meet with me sometime, after your grandmother's situation is resolved? I'd like to learn more about your experience, about how the church can do better for people in your situation. I looked at Maya, who nodded encouragingly. I'd be willing to have that conversation, I said. As Pastor Williams left, I realized that Grandma Rose's truth-telling was having effects far beyond our immediate family. Her story of hidden love and forced conformity was challenging people throughout the community to examine their own beliefs about sexuality, faith, and what it means to love unconditionally. But the most profound moment came that evening when Grandma Rose briefly regained consciousness and asked to speak with Maya alone. I stepped out of the room, giving them privacy for a conversation that I suspected would be important for both of them. When Maya emerged 20 minutes later, she was crying, but also smiling, her face radiant with something that looked like peace. What did she say? I asked. She told me that she sees Catherine in me, Maya said. She said that loving you gives her hope that love like hers wasn't wasted, that it lives on in us. She said that Catherine would have been proud to know that her love story inspired courage in someone else. Did she say anything else? She asked me to take care of you, to protect the love we have, to never let anyone convince us that what we have is less than sacred. Maya paused, wiping tears from her cheeks. And then she said something that I'll never forget. What? She said, love is the only thing that survives death, the only thing that makes life worth living, the only thing that connects us to the divine. You and Jessica have found something that most people spend their whole lives searching for. Don't ever let anyone convince you to take it for granted. That night, as Maya and I sat in our hotel room processing everything that had happened over the past 3 days, I realized that my grandmother's approaching death had somehow given life to relationships and understandings that had been dormant for years. Do you think she planned this? Maya asked as we lay in bed, holding each other in the darkness. Do you think she waited to tell her truth until she knew it would have the maximum impact? I think she was waiting for the right moment, I said. The moment when our family was ready to hear it, when it could do the most good and cause the most healing. She's an amazing woman. She is. And she's given us something incredible. Not just her acceptance and approval, but her story, her example of what happens when we choose safety over authenticity, and what's possible when we choose love over fear. The next morning, we received the call that Grandma Rose had passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the love and acceptance she'd spent a lifetime creating despite the personal sacrifices she'd made along the way. But her death felt less like an ending than a beginning, the beginning of a new chapter in our family's story, one where love was celebrated rather than hidden, where authenticity was valued over conformity, where the courage to be yourself was seen as a gift rather than a burden. The funeral would come next, and with it, another opportunity for our family to choose healing over hurt, understanding over judgment, love over fear. And I knew that Grandma Rose's spirit would be with us, guiding us toward the kind of acceptance and celebration she'd never been able to claim for herself, but had made possible for all of us. Grandma Rose's funeral was held on a Thursday morning at the same church where she'd worshipped for 40 years, taught Sunday school, and organized countless charitable events while secretly carrying the weight of a love story that had never been allowed to flourish. The sanctuary was packed with people whose lives she'd touched, many of whom were hearing her complete story for the first time. Maya and I sat in the front pew alongside the rest of the family, and for the first time in 5 years, I felt like I truly belonged there. Tom sat beside me, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand in gestures of support that would have been unimaginable just a week earlier. Linda sat on Maya's other side, treating her with the warmth and inclusion that had been missing from our family dynamics for far too long. Pastor Williams approached the pulpit with visible nervousness, and I could see him glancing in our direction as he prepared to deliver a eulogy, unlike any he'd ever given. Word of Grandma Rose's revelations had spread throughout the congregation, creating conversations and soul-searching that were still ongoing. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed sanctuary, "we are gathered today to celebrate the life of Rose Marie Henley, a woman who served this church and this community with unwavering dedication for 4 decades. But we're also here to grapple with some truths about Rose's life that challenge us to examine our own understanding of love, faith, and what it means to live authentically." I felt Maya's hand tighten in mine as Pastor Williams continued. "Many of you have heard by now that Rose carried a secret for 70 years, a secret about love that was real and deep and sacred, but that had to be hidden because the world wasn't ready to accept it. Rose loved a woman named Catherine Mills with the kind of pure, devoted love that we all hope to find in our lives. But because of the time she lived in, because of social expectations and religious teachings that prioritized conformity over compassion, she was forced to choose between love and survival. The congregation was completely silent, hanging on every word. Rose chose survival, as most of us probably would have in her situation. She married a good man, raised 5 children, and lived what appeared to be a conventional, successful life. But she never stopped loving Catherine, never stopped wondering what might have been, never stopped believing that love, all love, is a gift from God. Pastor Williams paused, looking directly at me and Maya. "Rose's granddaughter Jessica is here today with her partner Maya, and I want you all to know that Rose was proud of Jessica's courage, proud of the love she'd found, proud that someone in her family had been brave enough to choose authenticity over safety." I could feel the attention of the entire congregation focused on us, but instead of the judgment and discomfort I'd expected, I sensed something different: curiosity, perhaps even admiration. Rose's story teaches us several important lessons, Pastor Williams continued. First, that love is love, regardless of the gender of the people involved. Second, that hiding our authentic selves causes immeasurable pain not just to us, but to the people who love us. And third, that the church, this church, our church, has sometimes prioritized rules over relationships, doctrine over love, tradition over truth. I could see people in the congregation shifting uncomfortably, but Pastor Williams pressed on. I stand before you today to acknowledge that the church has failed people like Rose, people like Jessica, people like Maya. We have taken the beautiful message of God's unconditional love and twisted it into a weapon of conditional acceptance. We have driven away people who needed our support, our celebration, our embrace. The words were more radical than anything I'd ever heard in a church setting, and I could see the impact they were having on the congregation. But Rose's death gives us an opportunity to do better. Her courage in finally telling her truth gives us the chance to examine our own hearts, our own beliefs, our own capacity for the kind of love that sees beyond surface differences to the divine spark in every human being. Pastor Williams looked around the sanctuary, making eye contact with as many people as possible. So today, as we say goodbye to Rose Henley, I want to make a commitment on behalf of this church. We commit to being a place where love is celebrated in all its forms, where authenticity is valued over conformity, where people can come exactly as they are and find acceptance, support, and community. The silence that followed was profound, but it didn't feel hostile. It felt like the silence of people processing information that challenged them to grow, to change, to become better versions of themselves. When Pastor Williams finished his eulogy, he asked if anyone else wanted to share memories of Grandma Rose. To my surprise, the first person to stand was Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who'd been part of the church for as long as I could remember. I want to say something about Rose and about love, she said, her voice shaky but determined. 40 years ago, my husband left me for another woman. I was devastated, angry, convinced that my life was over. Rose was the first person to knock on my door, the first person to offer practical help instead of just thoughts and prayers. Mrs. Patterson paused, gathering her composure. Rose spent countless hours with me, helping me figure out how to rebuild my life as a single mother. She never once suggested that I should be ashamed of my divorce, never once implied that I was somehow defective because my marriage failed. She just loved me through the hardest time of my life. She looked directly at me and Maya. If Rose could love me through divorce, something the church used to consider scandalous, then I can certainly love Jessica through her relationship with Maya. Love is love, just like Pastor Williams said, and anyone who was good enough for Rose Henley is good enough for me. One by one, other congregation members stood to share similar stories of Grandma Rose's unconditional support, her ability to see past surface differences to the humanity underneath, her gift for making people feel valued and accepted exactly as they were. But the most moving testimony came from an unexpected source, Catherine Mills's daughter, Maria, who had driven from Birmingham to attend the funeral. I didn't know Mrs. Henley personally, Maria said, her voice carrying across the silent sanctuary. But I knew her through my mother's stories. My mother never forgot Rose Henley, never stopped loving her, never stopped wondering what might have been if they'd been born in a different time. The impact of her words was electric. I could see people throughout the congregation trying to process the fact that Catherine's daughter was here, validating the love story that had shaped my grandmother's entire life. My mother lived a good life, Maria continued. She was a devoted wife and mother, a pillar of her community, a woman who served others with grace and dignity. But she was never truly happy, never completely fulfilled. There was always a sadness in her eyes, a sense that she was living someone else's life rather than her own. Maria paused, visibly emotional. When my mother died 5 years ago, I found a box of letters in her bedroom. Love letters from Rose Henley, written 70 years ago, describing a love so pure and deep that it took my breath away. My mother had kept those letters her entire life, had read them when she needed to remember what real love felt like. The revelation that Catherine had kept my grandmother's letters was overwhelming. I felt tears streaming down my face as I realized that the love between them had never truly ended, had survived decades of separation and silence. I came here today to tell you that the love between my mother and Mrs. Henley was real, was sacred, was worthy of celebration rather than shame. And I came to tell Jessica and Maya that you represent the fulfillment of a dream that my mother and Mrs. Henley never got to live. After the service, the reception in the church fellowship hall was unlike any family gathering I'd ever experienced. People approached Maya and me with genuine warmth, asking about our relationship, our life in Portland, our plans for the future. The conversation was natural, comfortable, completely free of the tension and judgment that had characterized family events for the past 5 years. Tom found me during the reception, his face showing the effects of several days of intense emotional processing. "Jessica, I want you to know that I've made a decision," he said. "I'm going to start attending the church's new support group for families of LGBTQ+ individuals. Pastor Williams is starting it next month, and I want to learn how to be a better uncle to you and a better father to Rebecca's children if any of them turn out to be gay." The gesture meant more to me than I could express. "Thank you, Tom. That means everything to me. And I want to invite you and Maya to come stay with us when you visit Nashville," he continued. "I want you to feel welcome in our home, both of you, as family." Linda approached us as Tom was speaking, her face glowing with something that looked like relief. "I've been thinking about what Grandma Rose said about choosing love over fear," she said. "I realized that I've been so afraid of saying the wrong thing about your relationship that I ended up saying nothing at all. I want to do better." "What does that look like?" Maya asked gently. "It looks like asking about your life together, celebrating your anniversaries, treating your relationship with the same respect and interest I show for any other couple in the family," Linda replied. "It looks like getting to know Maya as a person, rather than as an idea that makes me uncomfortable." The most unexpected moment of the reception came when Maria Mills approached me with a small wrapped package. "This belonged to my mother," she said, handing me the package. "I think Mrs. Henley would want you to have it." Inside was a simple gold locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful. When I opened it, I found 2 small photographs, one of my grandmother as a young woman, radiant with happiness, and one of Catherine, equally beautiful and equally joyful. "They took these pictures at a church picnic in 1952, Maria explained. "They're the only photos I found of them together. My mother wore this locket every day for 70 years, even after she married my father. He never knew what the pictures were, but he knew they were important to her. I felt overwhelmed by the significance of the gift, by the tangible proof of a love that had endured despite impossible circumstances. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This means more than you can know." "My mother would want their love story to continue through you and Maya," Maria said. "She would want you to know that the courage you've shown in living authentically honors both of them." As the reception wound down and people began to leave, Maya and I found ourselves alone in the church sanctuary, sitting in the same pew where I'd spent countless Sunday mornings as a child. The space felt different now, not like a place of judgment and exclusion, but like a place where truth had been told and healing had begun. "How do you feel?" Maya asked, her arm around my shoulders as we sat in the quiet church. "Free," I said, surprised by the certainty in my voice. "For the first time in 5 years, I feel completely free to be myself with my family, free to love you openly, free to talk about our life together, free to be part of this community without hiding who I am." "Your grandmother did that for you," Maya said. Her courage in telling her truth created space for everyone else to tell theirs. "She did more than that," I replied, fingering the locket that now hung around my neck. "She showed me that love doesn't die just because it's forced underground. She showed me that authenticity is worth fighting for, even when the cost seems too high. She showed me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to hide who you are." That evening, Maya and I attended a small family dinner at Tom's house, where I was treated like the beloved niece I'd always been, rather than the disappointment I'd felt like for the past 5 years. The conversation was easy, inclusive, full of genuine interest in our life in Portland and our plans for the future. But the most meaningful moment came when Rebecca's teenage daughter Emma pulled me aside after dinner. "Aunt Jessica," she said, using the title that had been absent from family gatherings for years, "I want you to know that Great-Grandma's story has changed everything for me." "How so?" "I've been struggling with some things about myself, about who I might be attracted to, and I've been terrified that the family would reject me if I turned out to be gay," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "But seeing how everyone has responded to your relationship with Maya, seeing how Great-Grandma's story has opened everyone's hearts, it gives me hope that I can be authentic too, whatever that looks like." I pulled my great-niece into a hug, overwhelmed by the realization that my grandmother's courage was already creating ripple effects in the next generation. "Emma," I said. "You can always be yourself with this family. We love you exactly as you are, and will support you no matter what you discover about yourself. Promise?" "I promise. And your great-grandma Rose would promise too, if she were here." As Maya and I flew back to Portland the next day, I realized that we were returning to Oregon as different people than we'd been when we left. The healing that had begun at my grandmother's bedside had transformed not just my relationship with my family, but my understanding of love, courage, and what it means to live authentically. Grandma Rose's whispered words, "I always knew, I'm proud," had healed years of rejection and self-doubt. But her larger story, her courage in finally telling her truth, had done something even more important. It had created a legacy of acceptance and understanding that would benefit generations of our family yet to come. The love between Rose and Catherine had been forced underground for 70 years, but it had never died. Instead, it had taken root and grown in secret, nourishing my grandmother's capacity for unconditional love and ultimately creating the conditions for my own relationship to flourish openly and proudly. As our plane lifted off from Nashville, I looked down at the city where my grandmother had lived and loved and kept her secrets, and I felt nothing but gratitude. Gratitude for her sacrifice, gratitude for her eventual courage, gratitude for the family that had learned to choose love over fear, understanding over judgment. Maya took my hand as we climbed through the clouds, her fingers intertwining with mine, in the easy intimacy of people who no longer had to hide their affection from the world. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. I touched the locket at my throat, feeling the weight of two love stories, one that had been forced into shadows, and one that was now free to flourish in the light. "I'm thinking about legacy," I said, "about how Grandma Rose's hidden love created the foundation for our visible love, about how sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the courage to be authentic, even when we couldn't find that courage ourselves." "She would be so proud of what happened this week," Maya said. "The conversations that started, the hearts that opened, the family that came together. She would be proud that her great-niece Emma feels safe enough to explore her own identity without fear of rejection. She would be proud that Pastor Williams is starting support groups for LGBTQ+ families. She would be proud that Tom is learning to examine his beliefs instead of just accepting them blindly." Maya squeezed my hand. "And she would be proud that her granddaughter finally feels completely free to love and be loved without conditions." As Portland's familiar skyline came into view hours later, I realized I was returning home to a life that had been fundamentally changed by a week in Nashville. But the change wasn't just in my family relationships. It was in my understanding of what it meant to be part of a continuum of love that stretched across generations and overcame seemingly impossible obstacles. 6 months later, Maya and I returned to Nashville for our wedding ceremony, held in the same church where my grandmother's funeral had sparked such profound transformation. Pastor Williams officiated, speaking about love that transcends boundaries, courage that creates change, and the sacred nature of commitment regardless of gender. The entire family was there, Tom walking me down the aisle with tears in his eyes, Linda serving as Maya's matron of honor, Rebecca's daughter Emma reading a poem about love that conquers fear. Even Maria Mills came from Birmingham, bringing more photographs of my grandmother and Catherine from their brief time together. But the most meaningful moment came during the ceremony, when I felt a presence so strong, it was almost physical. The sense that Grandma Rose was there with us, witnessing the fulfillment of dreams she'd been forced to abandon, celebrating love that was finally free to exist in daylight. After we exchanged vows, Pastor Williams said something that captured everything our family had learned. Love is not diminished when it is shared openly. Love is not weakened when it faces opposition. Love is not lessened when it takes forms that challenge our expectations. Love simply is, constant, powerful, transformative, and ultimately victorious over every force that tries to contain or diminish it. As Maya and I danced our first dance as wives, surrounded by family members who were no longer afraid to celebrate our love, I thought about the whispered words that had started this transformation. "I always knew. I'm proud." Those words had healed years of rejection, but they had done more than that. They had revealed a truth that connected my story to my grandmother's, my love to hers, my courage to the dreams she'd been forced to defer. The love between Rose and Catherine had been forced underground, but it had never died. Instead, it had become the foundation for a different kind of love story, one where authenticity was valued over conformity, where families chose growth over stagnation, where courage created space for future generations to love freely. Years later, when Emma came out as bisexual during her freshman year of college, she called me first, knowing she would find understanding and celebration rather than judgment. When Tom's grandson announced he was transgender, the family rallied around him with support and acceptance that would have been impossible before Grandma Rose's revelations changed everything. The ripple effects of that whispered confession continued to spread, creating waves of change that transformed not just our family, but our entire community. The church became a beacon of inclusion. The support groups Pastor Williams started grew into a regional network, and the story of Rose and Catherine became a touchstone for other families, learning to choose love over fear. But perhaps the most beautiful outcome was the simplest one. Maya and I were able to build our life together, without hiding, without shame, without the exhausting work of managing other people's discomfort with our love. We were free to be completely ourselves, to love openly, to create a family that honored both the dreams Rose had been forced to abandon and the courage that had finally brought those dreams into the light. On quiet evenings, I would sometimes touch the locket that held photographs of Rose and Catherine, remembering the price of hiding authentic love and the power of finally speaking truth. Their love story had been incomplete, cut short by a world that wasn't ready to embrace it, but it had made our love story possible, had created the conditions for family acceptance and social change that allowed us to live freely. The grandmother who had whispered, "I always knew, I'm proud," had given me more than acceptance. She had given me understanding of how love transcends time and circumstance, how courage creates possibilities for future generations, how authenticity, even when delayed, has the power to heal and transform. The rejection I had carried for 5 years was completely healed, replaced by a family that celebrated, rather than merely tolerated our love. The secret Rose had carried for 70 years had finally been transformed from a source of pain into a foundation for joy. And somewhere, I believed, Rose and Catherine were finally together, their love story complete at last, watching over the family they had made possible through sacrifice, courage, and the unwavering belief that love, in all its forms, is the most sacred force in the universe. The healing was complete, the circle was whole, and love had won.